Welcome to the debate. Back in 1930, the economist John Maynard Keynes made a pretty famous prediction.
Right, the 15-hour work week.
Exactly. He looked at the massive productivity gains coming out of the Industrial Revolution and projected that, by the year 2000, we'd essentially just let machines do all the heavy lifting. We would choose leisure.
And yet, here we are, working harder than ever, I'd argue.
Yeah, and we're staring down a new technological wave. One that doesn't just replicate our physical muscle, but, well, it attempts to replicate our central nervous system.
Which makes this the ultimate economic stress test. I mean, we're watching artificial intelligence accelerate from routine calculation into complex, non-routine cognitive tasks. It really forces a reckoning. Are we watching the worker being elevated to a higher level of oversight? Or are we watching the worker simply be erased?
And that tension is exactly what we are exploring today. We're looking at whether we're entering a unique era of mass job displacement, or if the intense anxiety we feel right now is just a modern iteration of the centuries-old lump of labor fallacy.
Right. And to be clear on our framing, we are grounding this discussion in historical economic data, recent empirical studies on firm-level AI adoption, and theoretical labor models.
Exactly. I'll be coming at this from the economist's perspective, arguing that technological anxiety usually relies on that lump of labor fallacy, and that productivity-enhancing tech ultimately expands demand.
And I'll be taking the role of the skeptical worker advocate. I'm arguing that AI represents a structural shift that heavily favors pure labor substitution, leading to real displacements that historical models just failed to capture.
So let's just jump right into those positions. From an economic standpoint, the fear that machines will permanently eliminate the need for human labor almost always rests on a flawed assumption, the idea that there's a fixed amount of work to be done in the world.
The lump of labor fallacy, meaning, if a machine takes 10 tasks, there are 10 fewer tasks for humanity to do forever.
Right, which isn't true. The demand for human labor isn't an independent, static variable. It's a derived demand. It's derived entirely from the demand for goods and services. If you picture the traditional circular flow of an economy, businesses produce goods, households buy those goods, and the revenue flows back to businesses to hire more labor.
To produce more goods.
Exactly. When a technology like AI enters the picture, it drastically lowers the cost of production. Businesses generate higher margins, consumers get significantly cheaper goods. But that extra spending power doesn't just evaporate, it circulates. It creates new, unanticipated demand in completely different areas of the economy.
The old baking a bigger economic pie argument.
Right. It generates new jobs to fulfill infinite human wants. We've seen panics from 19th century Luddites to 1960s automation anxiety, and they failed to materialize because human wants just don't have a ceiling.
Look, I understand the historical resilience of the labor market. And yeah, we certainly aren't running out of human desires. But leaning entirely on the lump of labor fallacy ignores what economists like Daron Acemoglu point out about the wrong kind of AI.
Okay, explain that for our listeners.
Well, historical models assume that automation lowers costs, which spurs demand, which expands employment. But economic incentives right now are heavily skewed toward pure labor substitution. It's what Acemoglu terms so-so automation.
So-so automation?
Yeah, it's automation that is just barely good enough to replace a human worker, but not innovative enough to actually create entirely new industries or tasks where humans hold a comparative advantage. Not all automation leads to job expansion.
But the assumption there is that the substitution doesn't trigger a massive expansion in scale. Historically, when we automate a process, the scale of output grows so large that it requires an entire ecosystem of human support that, just didn't exist before.
Okay, let's test that scale argument. Let's look at the difference between the ATM phase of technology and the iPhone phase.
Okay.
When ATMs were introduced, they directly substituted the routine cash handling tasks of a bank teller. They lowered the operating costs of a physical bank branch so drastically that banks could suddenly afford to open hundreds of new branches.
And the net number of human tellers actually increased.
Exactly, because their roles shifted from counting cash to relationship banking, loans, customer service. That is the historical model working perfectly. But the iPhone phase is fundamentally different.
Because it decentralizes the action entirely?
Because it eliminates the physical intermediary altogether. The iPhone and the mobile banking architecture it spawned eventually allowed for completely autonomous digital banking. You don't need a teller for relationship banking when an algorithm customizes your loan terms instantly on a screen. AI is rapidly pushing cognitive work into that iPhone phase.
Right.
It acts as a scale-free resource. By that, I mean, unlike a human worker who can only review one contract at a time, a scale-free AI model can process 1 million documents simultaneously without drawing a single extra salary. It completely bypasses the human infrastructure.
The destruction of middle-class administrative paths in legacy banking is real, I'll give you that. But if we look at how automation actually restructures a supply chain, did the smartphone era really eliminate jobs, or did it just radically relocate them?
Well,
The mobile revolution created an entirely new app economy labor market. Millions of software developers, user experience designers, digital marketers, they all emerged to build the infrastructure that those banking apps run on. The new demand absolutely dwarfed the intermediary jobs it replaced.
but you're talking about very specialized tech jobs.
Which brings us to the theoretical mechanisms of how automation impacts the remaining human workers. Let's start this first round of our debate by looking at David Otter's concept of the O-ring production function.
Named after the Challenger shuttle disaster, right? Where one faulty O-ring brought down a vastly complex system.
Exactly. It's a brilliant mental model for modern knowledge work. Imagine a production process as a chain of interlocking rings, where every step has to succeed for the final product to have value. If AI comes in and automates certain repetitive, codifiable tasks, making those specific rings perfectly reliable and, well, practically free, what happens to the economic value of the remaining rings?
They become more important.
The human links in the chain become vastly more valuable. They become the bottleneck. If you automate the rote document review in a massive corporate litigation case, the human lawyer's strategic judgment, their courtroom presence, their negotiation tactics, those are now the constraining factors on growth.
Right, but because the rote work is cheap, the firm can take on vastly more cases. So, doesn't AI simply strip away the data processing tasks of a lawyer or analyst, amplifying the value of their high-level judgment?
The O-ring theory assumes the human always maintains the comparative advantage in judgment. It assumes the human is the indispensable final link. I counter that with Polanyi's paradox.
Michael Polanyi?
Yes. He famously observed that we know more than we can tell. Historically, this tacit knowledge is exactly what protected human workers from automation. We couldn't program a machine to drive a car through a chaotic city or write a persuasive legal brief because we couldn't explicitly write down the thousands of micro-rules that make up human intuition.
Right.
The O-ring theory works when machines are confined to explicit, rules-based tasks. But generative AI breaks Polanyi's paradox.
Because it doesn't need explicit rules, it learns the tacit patterns by analyzing massive data sets.
Exactly. It infers the rules we can't even explain. And because it breaks that paradox, it's aggressively moving up the cognitive ladder. It isn't just replacing the data entry clerk. It is currently shrinking high-wage, highly educated professions.
Shrinking them?
Yes. MIT Sloan Research recently analyzed firms adopting AI and found that top-paying roles like management analysts, research scientists, architectural drafters, they actually saw their headcount fall by about 3.5% over 5 years. When the AI's judgment on market analysis or structural integrity becomes better, faster, and perfectly scalable, the human is no longer the indispensable O-ring. The AI consumes the bottleneck.
But doesn't that fundamentally misunderstand what clients are paying for at the highest levels of the economy? Even if generative AI can perfectly synthesize case law or map out market variables, it lacks the capacity for fiduciary responsibility, for empathy, for strategic risk-taking under deep uncertainty.
Empathy is a luxury in many corporate settings, though.
But if an AI strips away the rote tasks of a senior management analyst, the productivity of that individual surges. They can handle 10 clients instead of 2. The total headcount of junior analysts might drop at that specific firm, but the firm's capacity to take on bespoke, highly complex cases expands.
That assumes the client wants human empathy more than they want a mathematically optimized instant outcome for a fraction of the cost. The data clearly shows that in business, financial, architecture, and engineering sectors, jobs are shrinking by 2% to 2.5% in highly exposed firms. The market is demonstrating that once the structural integrity of a building is secured, clients are perfectly happy to bypass the human element if the cost savings are substantial.
Well, let's move into our second round and test that theory by looking at what actually happens inside an organization when they try to deploy this technology at scale. If we move from macroeconomic theory to empirical firm-level realities, we find an incredibly complex picture.
The manufacturing data.
Yes, recent data from the U.S. Census Bureau examined AI adoption across U.S. manufacturing. When economists look at the firm-level data, they see a phenomenon known as the productivity J-curve. Early adopters of AI initially see significant productivity losses, not massive gains. A 1 standard deviation increase in AI use in these manufacturing plants was associated with a 1.33% drop in total factor productivity initially.
Which is how efficiently a firm is using its combined labor and capital to generate output. A drop means they are suddenly doing less with more. It is profoundly disruptive.
It is disruptive, but let's follow the curve. The bottom of the J represents costly adjustment and, crucially, co-invention.
Right.
Co-invention is the process where a firm realizes they cannot just plug a cutting-edge AI into an outdated organizational structure. They have to completely redesign their workflows, retrain their staff, rethink their supply chain. It's like, think of it like renovating a massive commercial restaurant kitchen while you are still trying to serve a Friday night dinner rush.
A very stressful Friday night.
Right. In the short term, output drops. The staff is bumping into the new layout. The automated ovens aren't calibrated to the menu. The workflow is chaotic. But the restaurant isn't enduring this to permanently serve fewer meals. They're restructuring so that next quarter, they can serve triple the volume with higher quality. The dip is the friction of transition. Once these growth-oriented firms weather this adjustment, the data shows they exhibit much stronger labor productivity and actual employment growth.
The restaurant kitchen metaphor paints a nice picture of temporary inconvenience. But if we dig deeply into the mechanics of why these manufacturing firms see those J-curve dips, we find structural upheaval. During this initial dip, manufacturing firms are dramatically increasing their work-in-progress inventory.
The WIP buffers? Yeah.
Materials are literally piling up on the factory floor because the predictive algorithms are clashing with the physical reality of the supply chain. Firms are sinking capital into new industrial robots, and crucially, we observe direct, immediate labor shedding, and the pain of this transition is not distributed equally.
It heavily impacts the older, more established legacy firms.
Because AI forces them to abandon decades of accumulated structured management practices. Consider a legacy manufacturing plant that has relied on lean manufacturing principles for 30 years. Lean is inherently a pull-based, human-centric system.
Right, Toyota Production System style.
Exactly. Frontline workers continuously monitor targets, they pull the and-on cord when there's an error, they provide localized feedback. It is paced by human capability. When management drops a centralized, predictive AI into that environment, they essentially obliterate the old knowledge generation system. They de-adopt the very practices that gave those seasoned workers a voice and economic value. For the frontline worker displaced during this chaotic unlearning phase, the J-curve is not a temporary dip on a macroeconomic chart. It is the permanent loss of their livelihood.
The loss of those older, structured management practices is severe, I agree. But isn't that unlearning exactly what is required to eventually scale? Lean manufacturing is brilliant, but as you said, it is designed for human pacing. Predictive AI operates on a completely different paradigm of efficiency.
But at what cost to the worker?
Well, yes, the older firms struggle to unlearn, and some workers face acute displacement, but the empirical data clearly shows that the young, agile firms, the ones that successfully execute that co-invention and survive the dip, experience up to 2% higher labor productivity growth long-term. And importantly, they hire more people. The destination is a more robust, highly productive enterprise that requires a new type of skilled human oversight.
The critical flaw in that optimism is the assumption of skill transfer. You're assuming the displaced frontline worker from the legacy plant whose tacit knowledge of lean manufacturing was just rendered obsolete seamlessly transitions to become the skilled overseer at the agile startup.
Well, retraining is a factor.
They do not transition. The skills do not transfer, and the geographic locations rarely match. The agile startup might recover its productivity and hire a team of data engineers, but the original blue-collar workforce is permanently hollowed out.
Which brings us to our third round, looking at the broader systemic effects of this technology on aggregate welfare. If we pull back from the individual factory floor and look at the broader labor market, we have to account for where the capital flows once these efficiencies are realized. Let's look at the Deloitte study examining the UK labor market over a 15-year period of intense technological automation.
Okay.
Technology directly displaced roughly 800,000 routine jobs, but simultaneously, it created 3.5 million entirely new jobs. And it is vital to understand the mechanism behind that statistic. When AI lowers operational costs across banking, logistics, and manufacturing, the price of goods falls. The savings realized by consumers and businesses flow directly into new service sectors, human-centric care, advanced R&D, and leisure industries. The new jobs weren't just data entry. They were roles requiring higher cognitive and social skills.
I look at that exact same systemic pressure, the drive to relentlessly expand output, and I see what labor economists call the tragedy of productivity. It perfectly explains why Keynes was so wildly wrong about the 15-hour work week.
How so?
Keynes looked at technology and assumed that once we could produce our basic needs efficiently, a rational society would collectively choose to reduce human labor. We would distribute the leisure. But he failed to account for a systemic coordination failure in the market. It is a massive structural prisoner's dilemma.
Because no individual firm can afford to unilaterally step off the treadmill.
Precisely. Firms are locked in a hyper-competitive, globalized market. Suppose firm A unlocks a massive AI-driven productivity gain. In Keynes's utopian vision, firm A would maintain its current output, cut its employees' hours to 15 a week, pay them the same wage, and everyone enjoys a better life.
But firm B won't do that.
Right. Firm B will take their AI productivity gains and use them to ruthlessly expand output/consumer prices and drive firm A out of business entirely. The market structure prohibits the realization of leisure. Firms are forced to use automation to aggressively restructure, maximize output, and shed labor costs just to survive. Therefore, AI won't lead to a utopian reduction in human toil. It's going to fuel continuous, aggressive, competitive restructuring, forcing workers onto an accelerating treadmill.
The treadmill analogy is potent, but if we look at the historical sweep of the last century, doesn't that treadmill run toward vastly higher living standards? I mean, Keynes underestimated human ambition. We didn't choose the 15-hour workweek because we didn't want to freeze our standard of living in 1930.
We wanted more stuff.
We wanted the fruits of that new labor. We wanted advanced biotechnology, global aviation networks, complex entertainment, the infrastructure for green energy. The tragedy of productivity assumes that forcing firms to compete is a negative outcome. But that hyper-competition is the engine that drives down the cost of life-saving medical imaging. It makes global communication nearly free. The treadmill is difficult, but the destination is objectively better.
It is an engine of flourishing for the owners of the capital, sure, and for the highly specialized elite class that designs the AI. But for the vast majority of the labor force, the reality of that treadmill is a declining share of the economic pie. Automation consistently reduces labor's share of value-added income, even when it raises aggregate productivity.
But the 3.5 million new jobs?
That net employment effect only materializes as a benefit if the new tasks created are secure and well-paying. But right now, tech investments are disproportionately focused on automating the new tasks just as quickly as the old ones. Our relentless drive for scale, combined with a scale-free substitute for human cognition, structurally prevents the average worker from accessing that flourishing.
Well, we have unpacked an incredible amount of complexity today, moving from the macroeconomics of derived demand down to the friction of unlearning on the factory floor. So, to summarize my position, I maintain that viewing AI strictly through the lens of permanent job destruction fundamentally misreads how human economies evolve.
The lump of labor fallacy.
Right. Human ambition is entirely unbounded. Now, the J-curve data proves that integrating AI is not a magic wand. It requires incredibly painful short-term organizational co-invention. But the empirical evidence demonstrates that once this friction is navigated, productivity gains lower costs, expand demand, and create sophisticated new roles. By automating codifiable tasks, AI will ultimately isolate and amplify the economic value of distinctly human traits: strategic judgment, adaptability, and complex problem-solving.
And I reassert that acknowledging the historical realities of the lump of labor fallacy must not blind us to the unprecedented nature of generative artificial intelligence. We have never built a scale-free resource that directly substitutes for human cognitive reasoning. The transition costs we see in the manufacturing J-curve prove that legacy firms and frontline workers bear the profound brunt of this disruption.
The friction is real, yes.
It's more than friction. The tragedy of productivity guarantees that without deliberate structural strategies to incentivize human augmentation rather than pure replacement, the market will default to maximizing output at the expense of workers' security. AI has the potential to cause profound structural hollowing out.
We may completely disagree on the ultimate destination of this technological wave, but we certainly share the understanding that artificial intelligence is fundamentally rewriting the relationship between human labor and capital. The source material we examine today contains much more to explore regarding how specific sectors are managing the intense friction of co-invention.
Absolutely. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the historical, infinite resilience of the labor market against the unprecedented, scale-free capabilities of modern AI.
Think back to the factory floor. The machines are humming, the predictive data is flowing, and the landscape is shifting rapidly under our feet. The question isn't just whether the economy will need humans tomorrow. The question is what specific kind of cognitive work those humans will be asked to do, and whether we are collectively prepared to navigate the profound friction of getting there.